Hey everybody, it's Michael. I'm back again with another walkthrough video, and today I'd like to show you Anno 1800, das Brettspiel, Anno 1800, the board game. You might already guess from the title, the board game, that this is of course an adaptation of the very famous and successful video game. I actually haven't played the video game Anno 1800. I've played many of the predecessors over the last couple of years, or decades actually. The game is by Martin Wallace, which is not too surprising because it's, well, all about industrialization. And actually, and I hope I don't mix this up, Martin Wallace was actually approached by Kosmos, the German publisher, whether he would like to, well, make a game about Anno 1800. So I guess they had the option to get the license from Ubisoft. So apparently this was not a finished design that Martin pitched to Kosmos, but rather some, I don't know whether it's a proper term, contract work. As I've already said, this is the German version by Kosmos. Currently this is the only version available. There's an English version coming out, I guess really soon. The game is pretty much language independent. Actually there are already many reviews and playthroughs of non-German speakers with the German version. The game is for 2 to 4 players, although there is a solo mode coming, and I think the English version, once it's out, will already have that included. The age suggestion is 12 and up, and according to the box, a game takes about 120 minutes. So if you don't know the video game, what's this all about? Well, basically it's about the Industrial Revolution. Each player controls a city, more or less set on an island. The city has population in 5 different ranks, from farmers up to investors. The population has demands, and you try to fulfill those demands to make your city grow. And to fulfill those demands you have to build up production chains that start quite low in complexity and move up in complexity towards the end of the game. Mechanically, this one's a bit hard to categorize. Basically, you just perform actions. And to demonstrate what I actually mean by that, let me now show you a full 3-player game. Enjoy! Okay, I've set up a 3-player game, and as always, let's take a brief look at the components first. Starting with, well, the main board in the middle, which is not like a common play area board, but rather a board to organize many of the gaming materials. We have the different industry buildings, population demand cards. There are 3 types. These are demands for the New World population. These are demands for artisans, engineers and investors. And these are the cards for the settlers and workers. Then we have population cubes for those 5 categories. Up here we have 5 mission cards. These vary from game to game. There's a pool of 20, I think, and you randomly draw 5. And there's a starting suggestion for the first game, which I'm not using. So let's take a brief look. These 4 will give extra points at the end of the game, while this one offers a special action during the game. In this game we try to collect artifacts or animals for our museum. Then there's a World Expo, where the player with the most investors at the end of the game will be rewarded. Then Eli Bleakworth rewards us with 3 points apiece for all these different rather basic industries, like beer, bread, schnapps and sausages. And over here, this lady will reward us for each New World island with 6 points. There's a fireworks token, which will be awarded to whoever triggers the endgame. And I'll explain in a minute how that works. Down here we have expedition cards, and over here we have Old World Islands and New World Islands. Over here we have various tokens, gold, trade tokens and exploration tokens, a reference sheet, and finally each player has a home board. Also, I've given each player a colored marker. Blue is a starting player, as we can see with this token. On the home board everybody has 10 pre-printed industries, 1 shipyard, 3 ships, 2 trading ships and 1 exploration ship. Each of them comes with one of these tokens, because each one has one of those symbols down here. And finally there are 5 areas for the different population cubes, and everybody starts with 4 settlers, 3 workers and 2 artisans. And this is why everybody also starts with 9 of these population cards. Basically for the 7 settlers and workers you have these 7 cards, and these 2 cards are for the 2 artisans. One small correction, the proper name for the green cubes is farmers, not settlers. These are the demands of our population, and the end of the game is triggered once a player has played the last of his cards. And we will get way more than just these 9 cards during the game, so we collect more cards, which we then have to get rid of again. But on the other hand, these cards give points, And once the endgame is triggered, the player who discards his last card first will get the fireworks token, which is an extra 7 points. And then the current round is finished, and one final round is played after that. And basically the flow of the game is very simple. There are no real rounds. I mean, the round is finished once everybody has taken their turn, but nothing happens at the end of the round. So we just go on and go on, each player taking one action until somebody triggers the end of the game. Finally, since blue is the starting player, red received 1 gold and yellow received 2. And then we can already start the game. So it's the blue player's turn. He has to take one action. There are many different actions available. Building industry, playing a demand card, changing demand cards, increase your workforce, upgrade your workforce, explore the old world, explore the new world, take expedition cards, and having a city festival. Also, here are all of blue's population cards. I've laid them out so we can take a short look. These down here are the more advanced ones, and it'll take some time until we can do these. And these up here are the more simpler ones. And if you take a look, for example, we see that both our advanced cards need these penny farthing bicycles, so this might be something we want to try and produce later on. And up here we have many of these basic industries that we need twice. For example, we need sausages twice up here, we need these generic goods twice up here. We can already produce them with artisans, but there is a building, an industry that lets you produce them with workers, which is usually better because usually you have more workers than artisans. However, since we have Eli Bleakworth in the game, it might be more interesting to start with something that is actually rewarded by him with 3 points, and these great goods are not on there. But continuing, we have 2 people that want bread, 2 that want beer, 2 that want schnapps, and 2 that want soap. We have only 1 who wants these canned goods, 1 who wants work clothes, and this one over here is interesting because he will give us an engineer actually when we satisfy his demand, but he also wants cloth, and for cloth we need to go to the new world and find cotton, which we definitely want to do, but maybe not at the start of the game. These 2 cards let us upgrade our workforce once we fulfill them. This one will give us an artisan, which is also great, while these ones down here will give us new blue workers, which is also good. And finally this lady over here will give us temporary trade tokens. Let's start with this guy, since he will give us an artisan. Now we can already produce crates, so let's now try to produce work clothes. The industry is over here, so our action is we want to build this industry. We take a tile, there are only 2 available of each kind. And to build this we need coal and we need yarn. Yarn is produced over here and it requires 1 farmer. So we take one of our 3 farmers, put it on this space, so every industry has 2 spaces, and now we have 1 virtual piece of yarn. There are no resource tokens for this. And for coal we need an artisan, so we take one of our artisans, put it on here, we have 1 coal and 1 yarn, so we can now properly build this industry. Now, these industries obviously cannot go into the water, they can go onto the shore. We could also overbuild one of our existing industries with this tile, but it's too early for that. We might still need everything. So we just flip this to the other side and put it down here on the shore. And now we have an industry where we can send our blue workers to produce work clothes. Also, we just earned 3 points, and that's already blue's first turn. Red decides to do something very similar. He uses a farmer to produce potatoes and an artisan to produce coal, which is everything he needs for a schnapps distillery. And so he can just put it here, also earning him 3 points at the end of the game. And yellow builds a sausage factory. For that he needs pigs, as well as coal. Coal is basically needed by every basic industry. Back to blue. We said we wanted to play this card. So, to play a card you have to satisfy the demand on that card. We can do this by producing work clothes with a blue worker down here. And then we need these goods, which we can produce with an artisan. Then we can play this card to our play area. So this is our play area, this is actually our hand. Let's just move this a little bit to the right. Now this card is played, it will give us 3 points at the end of the game, but we can still use the bonus. And we can activate it at any time in our turn. It's not an action, it's a free action, but let's activate it right now. So we flip this card over, but we get an artisan from the supply. He is available, but this is a new population, so we need to draw an appropriate card. Since it's an artisan, it has to be this card, so we just play the card. Our hand got smaller, but it's now getting bigger again. We get this guy over here, he needs work cloth, that's good, we already have that. Then he needs coffee, so we need to go to the new world and find some coffee beans. And he also needs these artillery guns. Red wants to build an industry for canned meat that requires pigs and iron. Pigs, as we know, are produced by farmers. Iron is produced by artisans. And so now has a factory for canned goods, or canned meat rather. Yellow takes the remaining Schnapps factory, so we're basically out of luck. We won't be able to get the 3 points for Schnapps because all 2 industries are gone. For that he needs potatoes and coal. Blue has 1 artisan remaining. That'll allow him to build any one industry basically, any one of the basic industries. Upgrading our workforce is probably not a bad idea, so let's build a bakery. A bakery needs grain and coal. Grain and coal. That's another 3 points for us at the end of the game. Red decides to play this card. It requires Schnapps and canned meat. He can produce both. So he gets to play this card and activate it immediately, so he gets 2 more blue workers. But these of course also come with 2 more cards. Yellow decides to play this card, requires sausages and Schnapps. Activate immediately, he gets another artisan. And of course one of these demand cards. Instead of building another industry, that'll give him 3 points through Eli Bleakworth. Blue decides to invest in his infrastructure a bit and to get an industry that lets you produce coal with workers instead of artisans. That requires planks. Planks are produced by farmers. Now he could overbuild this one since he now has a cheaper way, but given the fact that so much coal is needed, for now he decides to have it over here, so he can basically produce 4 coal. Red is lucky to have yet another card that requires Schnapps and canned meat, so he can simply produce each of these goods again. Play this card, activate it immediately, he gets an engineer. And of course another card. Yellow wants to build a brewery. It requires grain and coal. He can produce grain with his farmer. In his coal industry though, both spaces are full. Even although he has 1 artisan remaining, he can't just send it there. You can always send workers back with gold, but for an artisan that would require 3 gold. He only has 2. He now could, of course, like Blue did, build the other factory for coal that can be produced by workers, but he decides to trade instead. Whenever you trade, you pick another player and select a good that they can produce. It doesn't matter whether their industries are fully occupied or not. So he could either trade with red for this coal, or with blue for coal from here or over here. And now the interesting thing is that the amount of trade tokens it costs to trade depends on the kind of worker that produces the respective good. So if he wants coal from this industry, it'll cost 2 trading tokens, but if he wants to have one from here, it only costs 1 trading token since it can be produced by workers. So he exhausts one of his trade tokens, it's just moved off the board. He now has a coal, so he can place a brewery. But as a reward for trading, Blue receives a gold, and it's always 1 gold. No matter which good it was, no matter how many trade tokens were spent, the reward for being traded with is only ever 1 gold. Blue wants to build the other brewery. He can produce grain with a farmer, the coal with a worker in his new coal industry over here, and then he can place a brewery. He could of course place it on this board, but he has already a bakery and a brewery. And these are actually the only 2 industries that will ever require grain. So basically this grain building is no longer of use for him. So he decides to put the brewery over the farm. These 2 workers are just exhausted. Then moved over here off the board, and the brewery is now here. And that's another 3 points. Red decides to take the coal industry. He needs some wooden planks. He actually decides to overbuild his old one. Yellow builds a canned meat industry. He needs pigs and iron. He has 1 free spot down here. Not yet overbuilt anything, but he's running out of space. Blue decides to play this card. We can produce the beer ourselves, but we need Schnapps. So let's trade with the red player. Schnapps is produced by blue worker. So it's 1 trading token. Red receives the gold. And we decide to activate the card immediately, so we get 2 new workers. but of course also 2 new cards. And by the way, you can trade for multiple goods per round, so suppose we wouldn't have had any beer or schnapps, we could have paid 2 trade tokens and trade for both, either from the same player or from different players. The only thing you cannot do is trade for the same good more than once per turn. Red wants to build an industry for work clothes. He needs yarn and coal. Yellow plays this card, so he needs sausage and canned meat. He can produce canned meat like this, but then he's out of workers. However, he can do the end of shift extra action, which is not a proper action but just a utility action, where he can basically send any one population cube home, which means that the space where the cube was before is now free, and also that cube is available again. And calling the end of shift for a blue worker costs 2 gold, so he pays them, picks up the cube, sends it home, and well, basically he can send it to the sausage factory immediately again. Then this card is done. Yellow activates it immediately, so it also gets 2 new blue cubes, as well as 2 cards. And as you can probably see by now, the cards in your hand aren't getting any less, at least at the beginning of the game. Blue decides to build a soap factory for the pigs. He needs a farmer, but they're all occupied, so he pays a gold. Calling the end of shift for farmer only costs 1 gold, so this one is sent home and can be used to produce a pig. Then he needs coal. And then he has a soap factory. And since potatoes are only good for the schnapps distillery, and they're also all gone, he decides to overbuild the potato farm. Red decides to play this lady here. He needs work clothes, which he can produce, but he has no worker remaining, so he pays 2 gold, sends this one home, and then to the clothing factory. Then he needs beer, he needs to trade for that. That'll cost him 1 trade token, and let's say he trades with yellow, so yellow receives a gold. And then red can activate this card immediately to get 4 gold. Yellow decides to build a bag. He needs to pay his 1 gold to reactivate a farmer to get grain. Then both his coal buildings are occupied, and they're rather costly because there's artisans in there. So he decides to trade for coal. He can do that for 1 trade token, since the other players both have coal that can be produced by workers. Since red has so much gold, he decides to trade with us. And then the bakery can be built. And he also decides to put it over the grain farm, so this farmer here gets exhausted. Blue decides to play this card. We need canned meat, which we don't have, but we have yet another trade token. We decide to trade with yellow. Then we need soap. We have a new soap factory, which we can use our last worker in. We get yet another 2 workers. And yet 2 more cards. Red does something different for a change. He decides to expand in the old world. And both expanding in the old world and discovering the new world costs these exploration tokens. You can do both up to 4 times. And the first, for either the old world or the new world, costs 1 exploration token. So you can spend this from his exploration ship. There's a huge stack, so it's random. You can just place it next to your homeboard. They always offer 4 building spaces, 2 in the inland, 2 on the coast, as well as spaces for 2 ships. And they all have 1 bonus. In this case, it's another exploration ship, which immediately gets a token, so he can actually explore on his next turn again. And getting another exploration ship is not that easy actually, since it requires cannons. And for a cannon factory, you need quite a lot of stuff. This is quite a nice bonus. Now, since he has explored an old world island, his next old world island will cost 2 exploration tokens, but if he decides to discover the new world, since it's his first, that'll still cost 1. Yellow plays this card, so he needs schnapps and bread. He can produce both. He activates the card immediately, so he gets yet another 2 blue workers and 2 new cards. Blue decides to play this card for beer and bread. This one stays here, we won't activate it right now. Once we activate it, it'll give us 3 trading tokens, temporary ones. And once they're spent, they're spent. And the thing is, those only last until the next city festival. So at some point when we decide we want to reset everything, because everything is basically full, and we're not too far from that, I guess, The remaining tokens, if you already activated this card, are forfeited. So if we decide to activate it now, then we better be sure that we can actually spend these 3 tokens. Otherwise, let's just not activate this card until we've had our city festival. Red decides to activate his new exploration ship to now venture into the new world. He gets this island, but also 3 of these new world demands. But let's take a look at this one first. Each of these new world tiles always gives 3 new world resources. Cotton is on each tile, so you always get cotton, and then you get 2 other random goods. In this case it's rubber and sugarcane. And let's just put this here. And since we're playing with either Belsamento, red just scored 6 points. But let's not forget, we need also to draw 3 of these new world demand cards. Yellow also decides to explore or to extend in the old world, and he gets another trading vessel, which is also good. Blue decides to activate this card, so he gets 3 temporary trading tokens, and then since he has 3 cards that require sausage, he decides to grab the last sausage factory. That requires a farmer for pigs. He can spend a gold for that. And then he needs coal, so he decides to use one of his trade tokens to trade with red, since he has coal for just 1 trading token, although that gives him his 5th gold. And the question is where to put it. Pigs are still quite useful for chocolate and then later on for dynamite. Yarn is still useful for, well, maybe sails, if he wants to get an industry that allows him to build sails with workers and not with artisans. We still want to keep our coal factory, I guess. Bricks are still good, goods are still good, and iron is still good, and we also need sails. So I guess let's just put it on the shore. There's 1 soap factory remaining that'll give 3 points, and also red needs some soap down the road, so he decides to build it. He needs a pig, he can pay 1 gold to reactivate a farmer, and for the coal he could spend another 2 gold, but instead he spends his trade token. With that he has to take the coal from us, and he also decides to overbuild his grain production. Yellow decides to play this card. He needs beer and sausage. He can produce both. He decides to activate the card immediately, so he gets another artisan and another card. Blue also decides to explore and first extend in the old world. That's interesting. That's yet another of those blue coal factories, so now we actually have 2. So I guess we won't need that one. Red has still some gold left, so he could reactivate some population again, but he decides to perform a city festival. And that basically means that everything resets. The markers go back on the ships, and all the population cubes go back into their respective residences. Now if we still had any temporary exploration or trading tokens, those would be gone. He doesn't have, so that's his whole action. It did cost him a turn, but he's now ready to produce again with all his workforce. Yellow plays this card for the iron. He can take his free artisan and put him into the ironworks. For the schnapps, he has not enough gold to reactivate one of his blue workers, but he still has 1 trade token. He has to trade with red, giving him yet another gold, but now this card can be played. He won't activate it, since he still has 2 tokens that he somehow needs to spend. Blue decides to play this card, trade for both these goods, so these 2 are gone. Now if he only wants to spend 1 trade token for the coal, then that needs to come from red, but then he decides to get the schnapps from yellow. And he won't activate this card. Red decides to invest in a cheaper way to get bricks. He needs a coal. And then he builds this new brickworks over his old one. Yellow performs the city festival. And so does blue. Red continues with building up his infrastructure to be usable by workers, so he takes this ironworks. It'll cost him coal and brick, which now can also produce with just workers. And he also decides to build it over the old one. Yellow plays this card. It requires bread and beer. He activates it, gets an engineer. As well as another card. Since we need cloth for our engineer here, let's actually decide to go to the new world, because we know we'll get cotton. And the thing is, we wouldn't be able to use the red player's cotton to build our own cloth industry, because these goods from new worlds can only be traded by the player who owns that. Once the red player uses his cotton to build a cloth industry, we could of course trade for the cloth, but I guess we want to have our own one. We have cotton, rubber and coffee beans, which is good because we have at least one person who wants coffee later on. That's pretty for now. But we also get 3 of these cards, which is not bad per se. Red continues to build out his industry towards workers. He needs a brick, which he can produce with a worker. Then he has to exhaust one of his artisans. He only has 2, but the whole point was to get as many buildings working without artisans, at least for these basic ones. And well, he's almost there, because only the sales now still need artisans. Of course, now the other players can trade for all these cheap goods, because maybe they would rather pay 1 trading token to get these crates than send one of their artisans to their crate factory, but at least it'll give red some money. Yellow decides to build a cannon industry. For that he needs iron and goods. As just mentioned, he could pay 2 of his trading tokens to get both of that from the red player, but since he has 4 artisans, he decides to use them both. 1 over here, 1 over here. Then he has to exhaust his engineer, which is fine. Blue starts off by activating this card to get 3 temporary trade tokens. And then let's work on getting an engineer. So we need to be able to produce cloth. So let's build the industry for that. For the wooden planks, we just need a farmer. And to get the cotton, we need to spend 1 of our trade tokens to get the cotton from our new world. So we can build this. And as mentioned before, we now have 2 of these coal spaces, so we can safely overbuild this one. Red decides to build a brass industry. He needs coal and crates or goods. Crates are here, and to get coal he needs to reactivate 1 of his workers, but he can easily do that. And then let's put it over here over the potatoes, because he no longer needs them. Yellow decides to build the industry for sails that can be manufactured by workers. He needs yarn and wooden planks. He decides to overbuild the old one. Blue can play his engineer card. He needs cloth and soap. He activates card immediately. Gets an engineer and of course another card. And this one will require spending 6 of these exploration tokens, but in turn gives any new world resource, which would actually be great because then we don't have to find tobacco. But 6 exploration tokens is quite a lot. Red plays this card. He could actually produce both goods, but he has no workers available. He could activate 2 by spending all of his gold. That's a bit too expensive, so he decides to only spend 2 gold to recall the worker from the coal and get the soap. And then he spends 1 trade token to get the coal from the blue player. And then he can activate the card. This gives 3 population upgrades. They are free, you don't have to pay for them, but you can only upgrade green or blue cubes. And so he decides to upgrade 3 green cubes to blues, because he needs more blue obviously. He now only has 1 green remaining, but he hardly needs them. When you upgrade your population, you don't need to draw any new cards, because the amount of people doesn't increase, it's only their rank basically. And you could also do this as a normal action. If you take the upgrade action, you can upgrade any 3 cubes, and you always have to pay what's depicted in between. So for example, to upgrade an artisan to an engineer, that costs iron and windows. So basically by activating the card that Red just activated, he saved himself from spending 3 bricks. And the same also holds true for increasing your population. So far we've only seen this done by activating population cards, but you could always buy cubes, and when you take the action you can buy up to 3 by paying what's depicted above. So for example, to get a new artisan you need to pay bricks, coal and goods. Yellow decides to build another shipyard. The level 1 doesn't cost anything. For level 2 he'd need to exhaust an engineer. The one engineer he has is currently exhausted, so he decides to build a level 1 shipyard. Shipyards have to go on the coastline, so for example here. Blue builds a glass factory. The coal can be produced here. Now for the crates, he could use one of his artisans, or he could spend a trading token to get it from the red plant. That's what he decides to do. Red decides to build the industry for sewing machines. Those require iron, brass and an engineer. The engineer is exhausted. Brass can be produced here and iron over here. Yellow decides to build ships. When you build ships, each of your shipyards can build a ship equal to its level or less. So he has 2 level 1 shipyards, so each of those can build a level 1 ship. There are trading vessels and exploration vessels. He actually wants 2 of those. So you'll need 2 sails, 2 planks. He has to pay gold to empty up the space, and 2 cannons. And those can just go into the water. And of course they'll receive the appropriate tokens. Now that blue produces glass already, he decides to build a window factory. For that he needs glass, of course, as well as planks. And windows are pretty essential for getting engineers, because either way, if you buy a new engineer you need windows, and also if you upgrade an artisan you need windows. He still has 1 engineer, but he doesn't have any further cards that will give him engineers, so that's a good way to go probably. Red takes the other cloth factory. He needs cotton, which he has by spending a trade token. He needs planks. Yellow activates this card to get 3 trade tokens and then spends 1 of them to trade with blue for glass, since he also wants to build windows. For the wooden planks, however, he has to spend 1 gold. Blue decides to build a level 2 shipyard. He needs to exhaust an engineer. He needs planks. For that he needs to pay a gold. And he needs brick, which he can get by using an artisan. And he decides to overbuild his old level 1 shipyard. Red plays this card. He needs soap and schnapps. Decides not to activate it. Yellow plays this card. He can produce the bread himself, but for the soap he needs to spend a trade token. He could trade with either of the other players, but he decides to trade with blue. And then he decides to activate the card immediately, so he gets 3 free upgrades. This green cube becomes a blue one. Then he decides to make this green one into a blue one. For now, a blue cube sits on here, meaning that this space is still blocked, meaning that this cube is still occupied, until he's either sent back by paying gold or refreshed with a city festival. And then he also decides to upgrade 1 blue cube into a red one. Blue plays this card. He needs schnapps and working clothes. The schnapps he has to trade again. He decides to trade with yellow. And as you can see, we're basically switching back and forth between fulfilling demand cards, pretty basic demand cards, to get the rewards on them, and on the other hand grabbing the more advanced technologies because, well, it's a race. Red decides to increase his population. More specifically, he wants to have 3 new farmers, because every time you take that action you get up to 3 new population cubes of any combination. So for 1 farmer he requires planks, so he needs to reactivate this farmer by spending a gold. So that's his first one. He can use that farmer on here to pay the planks for the second one. And then he needs to spend yet another gold to reactivate 1 of those once again to get the third farmer. And then of course he needs to draw 3 more of these basic cards. And then he activates his upgrade card, so these 2 green ones can be upgraded to blue, as well as this farmer. Yellow pays 1 of his exploration tokens to get a new world tile. He has cotton, cocoa beans and sugarcane. And of course he needs to draw 3 cards. Blue plays this card. He has to provide sausage and bread. He decides to activate it immediately. Upgrade these 2 to blue and 1 of the blue to red. Red pays both his exploration tokens to get a second old world tile. This one has a factory for sales that requires workers, so probably this one can be overbuilt. Yellow decides to play this card. For that he needs 2 exploration tokens, which he still has. And then he decides to cash in the card immediately for 3 trade tokens. Blue plays this card. He can produce the sausage himself, but he needs to trade for the canned goods. He decides to trade with yellow. Then he activates this card to get a new artisan. And of course we get another card. We already had the demand for watches. Now we also have one for reading glasses. Red also decides to play a rather similar card. He can produce both goods by himself. So he also gets another craftsman, artisan. Yellow wants to upgrade his population. He gets 3 upgrades. First of all, he decides to upgrade a worker to an artisan. That requires coal and goods. He decides to trade for both. That's 2 of his tokens gone. He decides to get the coal from blue and the goods from red. Then next he would like to upgrade an artisan into an engineer. That requires iron and windows. He can produce both. So this artisan is now an engineer. And then finally he would like to do that again. He doesn't have any artisans left, so he needs to trade for both, which is fine because he has traded for neither of these resources in this turn. So for the windows he has to go to the blue player, and that requires 2 trading tokens since windows are produced by artisans. So blue receives yet another gold. And for the iron he can go to the yellow player. He can trade it for only 1 token. He can go to the red player. And so 1 more artisan is now an engineer. Blue decides to do something very similar. First he cashes in his trading tokens. Then he also wants to upgrade. The first move is to upgrade Craftsman to an engineer. He needs windows and iron. He can produce both. So let's say that this one down here is upgraded. Second, he produces another window. And then spends 3 gold to call Anno shift for this worker, so he can produce yet another iron. So that's the next upgrade. And for the third upgrade, he decides to trade for both goods. So he can trade for 1 token with red for the iron, and for 2 tokens with yellow for the window. And this one is also upgraded. And now he even has more engineers than artisans, so let's see how good of an idea that actually was. Red decides to build a new ship. He only has a level 1 shipyard, so he simply decides to build a trading vessel. For that he needs sails and wooden planks, so he needs to pay a gold to reactivate that farmer. Yellow also decides to build ships. He has 2 shipyards, but there's only space for 1 ship, so he only builds 1. Again, a level 1 trading vessel. Both wooden planks and sails are already occupied, so he needs to pay 3 gold in order to activate both of them again. Blue plays this card. The sausage factory is occupied, so he needs to pay 2 gold. For the crates, he decides to trade with red, so it only costs 1 token. He immediately activates the card. He would like to upgrade 3 workers into artisans. So 1, 2, and 3. Red plays this card. He doesn't have any beer, so he needs to trade for it. He decides to trade with yellow. And then for the crates, he needs to spend 2 gold. And then he can get a new artisan. Along with another card, of course. Yellow decides to play this card. He needs cloth, which he needs to trade for. That'll cost him 2 trade tokens. And he decides to trade with blue. Then beer, he can produce himself. And finally, he just needs to spend another trade token. Then he can turn in this card, and that'll give him 2 expedition cards. These are kept down, so let's just wait until the blue player gets some, which he probably will at some point, and then I'll explain them. Blue only has 1 artisan left. That doesn't get him anything. No trade tokens, just 1 gold. So he decides to perform City Festival. Red also decides to perform City Festival, and so does yellow. Blue decides to take a coal industry. For that he needs sewing machines. That'll cost him 2 trade tokens, and he can get them from the red player. Then he needs cloth and goods. And he decides to overbuild his yarn industry because he probably won't update his sales factory. Red decides to grab the other one. He can produce everything himself. Yellow grabs the brass industry. He decides to trade for both goods, since he's short on artisans. That will require 2 tokens. For the coal he decides to trade with the blue player, but the cheap goods he can only get from the red player. And he also decides to overbuild his yarn industry. Blue decides to build a level 2 trading vessel. He needs sails, crates, and planks. Red plays this card. He needs bread and cloth, but he needs to trade for the bread. He decides to trade with yellow. Then he activates the card, gets another engineer, and of course a new card. Yellow decides to build the glass factory, crates and coal. Again he decides to trade for both. So again blue and red will receive a gold each, and of course he has to pay 2 tokens. And he puts it over here. Blue decides to play this card. He decides to trade for both goods. The iron has to come from red, but the canned meat can come from yellow. So that's another 2 trade tokens gone. They both receive a gold, and blue gets 4 gold. Red plays another card. He can produce the bricks, but needs to trade for the sausage with yellow. So he gets yet another engineer and yet another card. Yellow builds a watch factory. He needs glass and brass. He needs to exhaust an engineer. Blue decides to build yet another trade ship. He needs sails, planks, and crates. So he needs to call the end of shift for one of these artisans. That'll cost him 3 gold. Red plays this card. He produces a soap himself. However, he needs to trade for the sausage once again. Decides to trade with yellow. Activates the card, so he gets 3 upgrades and updates 3 blue cubes and red ones. Yellow plays this card. This once again means he has to spend 2 of his exploration tokens to get 3 trade tokens. He decides to use them immediately, or rather to get them immediately. Blue decides to upgrade his population. He produces a coal and trades for some goods with red. So he has these 2 resources, so his first upgrade is blue to red. Then for the second upgrade he would like to do that again, so he produces another coal. Now he cannot trade for the crate goods a second time, because you can only trade for the same good once on your turn. So he needs to produce them himself, which will cost him 3 gold. But then he has again both resources to upgrade a second red cube, and then he decides to upgrade from an engineer to an investor. That'll require 1 coat, as well as the exhaustion of another craftsman, but then this one is an investor. Red decides to do something similar, so he would like to upgrade 2 engineers to investors. For that he needs 2 coats. He needs to exhaust 2 craftsmen, and then he has a 3rd upgrade available, and he would like to do this, so he needs a coal and some goods. Yellow decides to play this card. First he needs a watch, then he needs some cloth. He needs to trade for that, with 2 tokens. Decides to trade with blue. Then he needs to spend another trade token. Then the exclamation mark on this card says it has to be activated immediately. And this means he can discard 2 of his cards still in hand. So he decides to discard these 2. They go at the bottom of the deck. And now his hand has gotten pretty small. Especially if you compare it to the one from the red player. Blue decides to build a coffee industry. He needs coffee beans. For that he needs to spend a trade token. Then he needs coal. Still has 1 worker. He has his second coal building over here. Red decides to build industry for steam engines. He needs to exhaust an investor. He needs iron and brass. Yellow builds a level 2 shipyard. He needs brick and planks. He also needs to exhaust an engineer. And he decides to build this shipyard over here. With only investors and engineers remaining, no trade tokens and just 2 money, it seems that blue needs to do a city festival again. Red builds a level 2 shipyard. He needs brick, planks and has to exhaust an engineer. Yellow decides to build ships. First, a level 2 exploration vessel. He needs to exhaust an engineer. He needs cannons, planks and sails. He decides to overbuild one of his old trading vessels. And then he still has his level 1 shipyard. So he decides to build a level 1 exploration ship. He needs sails. Planks. That'll cost 1 gold. And he'll also need another cannon. Since there are no craftsmen available, that'll cost him 3 gold. And he decides to also overbuild this ship. And stuff that's overbuilt is returned to the supply. Blue builds a Dynamite Factory. For that he needs pigs. As well as brick and crates. He decides to overbuild the pig farm. Because the only thing that pigs would be useful now is chocolate. He doesn't require any chocolate. He doesn't even have cocoa beans yet. So he probably won't need the pigs. Red wants to build a factory for steam cars. He needs rubber, which he can get by spending a trade token. He doesn't have any trade tokens, but since Baron O'Mara is in play, it is possible to trade 2 exploration tokens for 1 trade token. So this is what he does. So that's his rubber. Then he needs a steam engine that requires an engineer. He can pay 4 gold to refresh that engineer and put him on the engine. And then he needs to exhaust an investor. Yellow plays this card by paying 2 exploration tokens. Blue can now build a factory for these guns. He needs to exhaust an investor. He needs to produce dynamite. And he decides to trade for the iron with the red player. And then he decides, since he still has 2 coal factories, to overbuild 1. Red is pretty much spent, so he decides to perform City Festival. Yellow has another one of these cards. He still has 2 exploration tokens. Blue can play this card. He needs work clothes. He needs coffee. And he needs his guns. So that's 8 points and 3 temporary exploration tokens. He decides to cash them in immediately. Red decides to play this card. He can produce soap. He needs to pay 2 trade tokens to trade for the coffee from blue. And he can use his engineer to produce a steam car. He decides to activate the card immediately. He can do 3 upgrades starting at either blue or red. And he decides to upgrade 3 artisans. That's also 8 points for him. Yellow activates both cards to get 6 trading tokens. Then he plays this card. He needs to spend 1 trading token. He needs to trade for both soap and cloth. So that's a total of 3. He decides to spread it evenly, so red gets a gold and blue gets a gold. And then he can draw 2 more exploration cards. And yes, I still haven't shown you how these actually work. Blue decides to upgrade. Produces a coal. And trades for some goods with red to turn this blue one into a red. Next he produces a window and some iron to upgrade a red into an engineer. And then finally he exhausts the Craftsman, pays 3 gold to trigger the end of shift for this one to produce a coat, and so he can upgrade an engineer into an investor. So he also has 2 investors, the same as red, so currently they're tied for the 10 points from the World Expo. Red builds a rum distillery, he needs planks and sugarcane. For that he needs to spend a trade token. Yellow decides to trade some of his population cards, and he can trade up to 3 cards. He decides to trade 2 by putting them under the respective stack and drawing new ones from the top. Blue decides to build a factory for penny farthings. He needs to exhaust an investor. He needs rubber, which he can get from here by spending a trade token. He decides to get the iron from the red player, and since he probably won't need sails anymore, he decides to put the factory here. Red plays this card. He needs a coat, rum and a steam car, and whenever he activates that card he'll get another action, so he decides to keep it around for now. Red builds a chocolate factory. He needs pigs, so he needs to pay a gold. And he needs cocoa, which he can get by spending 1 trade token because he has it up here. And he builds it over the pig farm. Since he still has 2 cards that require watches, blue decides to build a watch factory. He needs to exhaust an engineer. He needs glass. He doesn't have any workers available, so he pays 2 gold to move 1 over there. And then for the brass, he can trade with yellow. And he decides to overbuild the bread factory. Red decides to build a gramophone factory. He needs to exhaust an investor. He needs to pay a gold to get some planks. And he needs some brass. Yellow has 4 workers remaining, but not much else, so he decides to call for a city festival. But this also means that this token is removed. Blue decides to spend 2 of his exploration tokens to get another new world island. It's 3 cards, yes, but on the other hand it's also 6 points. So you got cocoa beans and tobacco. Tobacco is good because here's this card over here which needs cigars. But of course there are also 3 new cards. And of course 2 of them require bread, which he just overbuilt, but on the other hand he can still trade for it. Red decides to build a champagne factory. He needs to exhaust an investor. He needs to trade for glass by spending 2 of his exploration tokens. He decides to trade with yellow, and finally he needs some goods. Yellow decides to spend 2 exploration tokens, discover another old world island, a new world. So apparently he's not yet ready to end the game. And he also draws 3 new cards. Blue spends his 2 exploration tokens to get another old world island because he's seriously running out of space. He even gets 2 new workers, which of course also come with new cards. Red decides to build another trade ship. For the planks he needs to spend a gold, but then he can produce goods and sails. Yellow pays 3 exploration tokens to get yet another new world. Blue decides to fulfill this card, soap and rock cloth, for 4 gold. Red plays this card. He needs champagne. He needs coffee, which he needs to trade for 2 trade tokens. Blue is the only player in his coffee. And then he needs a gramophone, which he can produce with 1 of his engineers. Winner once he can discard 2 cards, but if he decides to do so, it has to be immediately, and he decides to discard these 2 cards. And then this is done. Yellow decides to build a champagne factory. He needs to exhaust an engineer. He needs goods and glass. He decides to overbuild his shipyard. Blue decides to do a city festival. Red also decides to make some dynamite. For the pig, he needs to spend the gold. Then he needs bricks. And he needs to spend another 2 gold for the crates. And he decides to build it here. Blue decides to play this card. He needs schnapps, which he has to trade for. With yellow. Then he needs a watch. And a penny farthing. Then he can discard 2 cards. He decides to discard these because they have very high requirements in exploration tokens. Red builds a gun factory. He needs to exhaust an investor. He needs iron. And he needs dynamite. Yellow plays this card. So he needs sausage, champagne and chocolate. Then he can perform 3 upgrades. He decides to upgrade 3 blues to red. Blue decides to build a cigar factory. He needs wooden planks. He also needs tobacco, which you can get from over here for 1 trade token. With almost everything spent, Red decides to do a city festival. Yellow plays this card. He needs chocolate, coats and glasses. He can make the chocolate and the glasses himself. He needs to trade for the coat, that costs 2 trading tokens. And he decides to trade with red. He decides to use that action immediately to build a factory for sewing machines. He needs to exhaust an investor. He needs brass and iron. He can get the iron. He doesn't have any workers left, so he pays 3 gold to get some brass. And he decides to overbuild his brick works. Blue plays this card. He needs iron, tobacco and penny farthings. And then finally, he also gets to draw 2 exploration cards. Normally these are hidden, but let's just put them face up. And these basically represent both animals and artifacts you bring back for your zoo and museum respectively. And at the end of the game you can send population cubes from the quote-unquote upper class, so artisans, engineers and investors there. And if you're able to fill one of these spots, then you get the respective points. So right now, to fulfill all these cards at the end of the game, we'd need 2 investors and 2 engineers. We have that, of course. And the interesting twist is that we have the museum, so each visit to the museum or each artifact is worth 1 point more. So this is actually worth 4 points and this is worth 3 points as opposed to the other 2. So it would be interesting to get more cards, so we can send this investor, for example, to the museum and this engineer also to the museum. But right now, these are 12 points. Red plays this card. He needs work clothes, guns and has to spend a trade token. He decides to activate the card immediately to get 3 exploration tokens. Yellow decides to perform a city festival. Blue plays this card. That will require a lot of trading. So he needs to trade for canned goods, which he decides to get from yellow. He can produce watches by himself. And then he needs to trade again, this time for the glasses. Those are 2 trading tokens. And again he decides to get them from the yellow player. Then you get another 2 expedition cards. This card is done. And that was actually our last 8-point card. Let's see for the expeditions. Okay, now we have 4 spots for investors. Only 2 investors. Maybe it would be a good idea to upgrade a little bit further to also fill these spots. And also we do have spots for our 3 engineers right now. Although again, it would be preferable if there were more on the right side. Red plays this card. He needs goods. He needs sewing machines, which he doesn't have. So he decides to get them from yellow. That costs him 2 trade tokens. And then he needs steam cars, which he can produce himself. Those will be 3 exploration tokens again. He decides to not activate the card at this point. Yellow plays this card, which requires 6 exploration tokens. He can spend those by moving everything off his ships. He gets to discard 2 cards, and he decides to do that. Blue plays this card. He needs coats, sausage and a trade token. He activates the card to get 2 more expedition cards. Red plays this card. he needs to trade for both bread and chocolate, and yellow is the only player where he can get any of it. Chocolate costs 2, bread costs 1, so he can use 2 exploration tokens, thanks to Beryl O'Mara. And finally he needs a gramophone, which he can build himself. And he decides to activate one of those cards now, to get another action, and with that action he spends 2 exploration tokens to draw 3 expedition cards. Yellow plays this card, he needs to spend a trade token, he needs a sewing machine and canned meat. He decides to activate the action immediately to build a level 2 trade ship. So he needs sails, goods and planks. So it probably wasn't the best idea to overbuild that shipyard, because right now another trade ship would be great. Blue plays this card, he needs sausage and work clothes. And then he can upgrade 3 blues to reds. 1, 2 and 3. Red plays this card, he needs schnapps and work clothes to get 4 gold. Yellow plays this card, he needs a trade token, watches and work clothes. For them he needs to trade. That costs 1. He decides to trade with blue. He decides to activate the card immediately to get another action. To once more build a level 2 ship. Sails, goods, planks. Blue performs the city festival. Red plays this card, he needs iron and work cloth. For the work cloth he actually has to spend 2 gold, but then he gets 4 back. He's down to 2 cards. Yellow plays this card, he needs canned goods, cloth and a trade token. The cloth he needs to trade once again for 2. This card is done, he can get another action. Unfortunately he can't continue by getting more trade tokens, which, well, he needs, because the supply has run out of level 2 trade ships. So what he actually decides to do is a city festival. Blue plays this card, he needs to spend a trade token. He needs to spend another trade token because he doesn't have schnapps. He decides to trade with yellow. And finally he needs cloth. And he decides to keep the card around. Red decides to cash in this card and then spend 2 tokens to draw 3 exploration cards. Yellow plays this card. He needs glasses. He needs cloth, for which he will have to trade. That costs him 2. Let's say he trades with blue. And finally he needs an additional trade token. He gets 2 more exploration cards. And since that was the last card in his hand, the endgame is now triggered. So we finish the current round, which is basically finished since blue is the starting player. And then we play for another round. That is, each player will get 1 more turn. And let's not forget, yellow gets the firework tokens, granting an extra 7 points. So blue's original plan was to fulfill this card, to be able to discard the other 2. But since there's no second place for going out, that doesn't make any sense anymore. So let's actually try to fulfill this card, because it'll at least give us 2 more expedition cards. And maybe then we can optimize a little on which population cubes we still need. So first of all, we need cloth and a trade token. We need to trade for the bread with the yellow. When this card is done, we get 2 more expedition cards. The deck has almost run out. And then we can activate this card to get 1 final action. We can try to fulfill a demand, because that's 5 points. We cannot explore a 3rd island, which would be 6 points. But I guess we can still try to upgrade some population cubes to have a better distribution of those cubes among the cards. Looking at the cards, since there are 1, 2, 3 spots on the right side which give more points, and with only 2 investors, it would be a good idea to at least get 1 more investor. But the thing is, we're also competing for the World Expo, for the 10 points from that, with the red player, and he also has only 2, with the possibility to probably also upgrade. The good thing is, even if we tie at 3, for example, we both get the 10 points. So let's only get 1 more investor and maybe hope that red doesn't upgrade too. Okay, so we want to do 1 upgrade this way. For that we need codes, And we need to exhaust artisan. And then let's do the other two upgrades over here. So for that we need 2 times iron and 2 windows. And that's it. Blue is done. Red first performs the City Festival, which also means that these tokens are gone. Then he uses this action to play this card. He needs a trade token. He needs schnapps. And he needs a penny farthing. That'll cost him 3 trade tokens. He can only get it from blue. But then this card is done. It gives him another action. And then he can play this card. He needs cloth. A steam car. Oh, we didn't remove this cube apparently. And then watches. For that he needs 2 trade tokens, which you can barely get. And then he decides to trade those from yellow. This card is done. It's another 8 points. He could discard 2 cards. This was also his last card. And then he is also done. Yellow, of course, doesn't have any cards in hand anymore. It does make sense to try and compete in the investors for the expo, because he did at least 2, and that would give him 4 points, because then he would be tying with red for the 2nd place. The best thing he can actually do is spend 4 exploration tokens and get a 4th island, because in this game that'll grant him 6 points. He doesn't bother withdrawing cards because he wouldn't be able to fulfill them anyway. And then we're done, so let's move to the final scoring. There isn't a score sheet or pad of sheets actually that comes with the game, but you can print this one from the homepage. First of all, the population cards that are worth 3 points. Blue has 13 of those for 39 points. Red has 12, so 36. And yellow has 11, so 33. Then next up, the ones that are worth 8. Blue has 4 of those, so 32. Red has 6, so 48. And yellow has 3, so 24. And finally the ones that are worth 5 points. Blue has 3 for 15. Red has 2 for 10. And yellow has 7 for 35. So you can already see that there are huge differences in who did what. Next are the expedition cards. For blue, it looks like this. He still has 2 artisans left over, for which he didn't have any spots, and there are a couple of spots still open in the zoo. So let's add all of these together, and remember, everything on the right side in the museum is worth 1 point more. So we have 4, and 3 is 7, and 2 is 9, and 3 is 12, 13, 17, 19, 23, 25, 26, 29, 30, 32. For red, it looks like this. He could have used a couple more engineers. 1, 3, 6, 9, 13, 14, 18, 19, 22. And for yellow it looks like this. He only had 1 spot for an investor, and on the left side, so it maybe didn't matter that much that he didn't try to get investors at all. 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12, 15, 17, 19. Then gold. You get 1 victory point or renown for every 3 gold. So blue gets 3, red gets 3, and yellow gets 2. Then the firework. Yellow will get 7 points for that, the other obviously nothing. And then we have mission cards 1 through 5. Number 5 was a card with an ability that was triggered during the game, and we actually also already counted the extra points for card number 4, the museum, so we're actually only looking at cards 1 to 3. Number 1 was Isabel Samento, 6 points for every New World Island, so blue gets 12, red gets 6, and yellow gets 24. Then card number 2 is Eli Bleakworth, 3 points for each of these industries, and yes, it was stupid to return the bread and the beer, because each player who did that basically lost 3 points. Blue still has 4 left: work clothes, sausages, soap and beer, so that's 12 points. Red also has 4: work clothes, canned meat, schnapps and soap. And yellow also still has 4, so also 12 points. And then finally we have the World Expo, 10 points for blue, because he has 3 investors, and the second place with 4 points goes to red, because he has 2 investors. And the final scores are red with 141, blue with 155, and yellow with 156, making him the overall winner. And that was one full 3-player game of Anno 1800. Before we wrap this up, let's take a look at all the mission cards, not just the 5 you saw in this game. And as I said before, this is where a lot of the variability in the game comes from. First of all, there are more cards that reward you for having the most or the second most of something. Population cubes overall, engineers, expedition cards, and trading tokens. Then there are more cards that reward you if you have certain industries. Then there's the equivalent to the museum, the zoo, where each visited animal is worth an extra renown. Then this lady over here rewards you with 18 points if you have a maximum of 1 old world island. So you really have to make use of the space on your main island and 1 old world island to get those 18 points. And finally, this guy penalizes you with -2 for each card left in your hand at the end of the game, which really changes things because, as I said before, there's no second place for getting rid of all your cards, but in this case it's not very good to still have cards in your hand. And then finally we have more of these effect cards. We saw this one, which could actually be used multiple times per turn. All of these can only be used once per turn. Here you can use 2 exploration tokens to get rid of a card. Here you can buy extra actions for a very steep price, and this guy lets you exhaust an investor to get 5 gold. And then there's a mini expansion which can also be printed from the Kosmos homepage with 2 more cards. Unfortunately, they are not really cards, so if you want to shuffle all of them, you'd have to find a solution how those can be included. This guy lets you, instead of drawing a new card when getting population, you can pay 1 or 3 gold respectively to not draw that card. And this lady gives you 2 gold whenever you discard one of your industries. So, I hope you've enjoyed this overview of Anno 1800, the board game. A couple of thoughts. First of all, is this a good representation of the video game? As I said, I haven't played the video game Anno 1800, but I've played other games from the series. Or maybe first, let's take a step back and compare Anno 1800, the board game, with other board game versions of the Anno 1800 series, because back in, I think, 2003, there was a version of Anno 1503, also published by Kosmos, designed by Klaus Teuber. This game had rather bland artwork, I'm afraid, so it was like very generic artwork coupled with screenshots or rather images from the video game. And here the focus was more on sailing around with ships, discovering islands, and then building up cities, and you had small representations of these production chains, but very basic ones. And then in 2007 there was a board game version of Anno 1701, again by Klaus Teuber, which was more or less a Settlers of Catan or Catan clone, mixed in with the Cities at Night expansion. So again, sailing around on a board, building cities, building multiple cities, connecting them, and developing through cards that were of course inspired by events and buildings in the video game. Then in the same year there was a card game version for Anno 1701, and that was basically a clone of the 2-player Settlers of Catan card game. From all these different board game versions, I think this is the most complex one and also the best. But now comparing it to the video game, many elements, as far as I can tell, are there. I think Anno 1800, since it's about the Industrial Revolution, the video game introduced the concept of trains. That's of course not in the board game yet, maybe there's an expansion. The focus is of course very much on your central island and the city you're developing there. Other parts like trading, sailing around, exploration are pretty much abstracted away. The game, I guess, could have been very different, with a focus on exploration, sailing around, yes of course developing cities, founding new cities, having trade routes, but then the part of how you develop your city and all those production chains could have been the one that was abstracted. And also in the video game you have to meet the demands of your people, yes, but if I remember correctly, their demands are not only in goods, so they want, for example, churches, theaters, marketplaces. You also have to think about security, so basically you need firefighters, law and order and these kind of things, and this is also not appearing in the game. It's very much oriented towards production chains, not that this is necessarily a bad thing, but you have to know this if you want to get into this game. Regarding player count, I've only played this with 3, I haven't played 2 or 4 players. Since there are always 2 of any given industry, in a 2-player game everybody can build everything, and in a 4-player game the competition is probably much higher. But apart from that, I would assume that all player counts work. I haven't tried the solo mode yet, it's not really available. On Board Game Geek there's a chance to actually preview it and playtest it. In a couple of days, I think Richard Rado-Ham will upload his video for Anno 1800, and I think he will be showing the solo mode. I think the element most discussed online is the endgame trigger, because basically, since it's entirely player controlled, the game could theoretically never end if nobody wants to force the end. I don't think that is a real problem. Yes, games can go quite long. They can definitely go longer than the 90 to 120 minutes printed on the box. I would also suggest not to play with 4 players when you're playing the game for the first time. But on the other hand, at least in my games, those 3 hours never felt like long, because you're just making these tiny actions and then it's the next player's turn, you're always engaged. There's not much downtime actually, and so these 3 hours just flew by, at least in my games. I guess the difficult but also rewarding part is finding the right pacing. So to know when it's advantageous to play your last card, trigger the end game, get that 7 extra points, and maybe have your opponents in position where they're not quite able to finish the game. There are also discussions online that the game is maybe too short, or that it can, or that the endgame can be triggered rather soon with a quote-unquote rush strategy, which is fine on one hand because then the game doesn't go on as long. On the other hand, there are all these buildings, like for example the level 3 shipyard and the level 3 ships and some of the investor buildings that you won't be able to see if the game ends early, and that can be a bit underwhelming, disappointing. There are quite some discussions online on how to avoid such a rush, or whether it even exists. The game is quite complex strategy-wise. So for example, city festivals. On a first glance it would appear that city festivals are bad because they cost you an entire turn. On the other hand, they reset everything, so you're much stronger in the turn afterwards because you can do more without having to trade for something, without having to spend gold. So maybe the notion that you would assume in the first place that you have to avoid city festivals at all costs and it's rewarding to drag out every city festival as long as is possible is wrong. If you compare it to games like Everdell or for example Tapestry, where you have a fixed amount of those reset turns, then in those games it makes sense, because if you spend all those resets then the game is over. But here you can basically take as many resets as you like. Yes, sure, if you can take one less reset in the entire game by properly optimizing when you take one, then yes, that's an action gained. And the same is basically about spending gold. Yes, it's a resource, and yes, it gives you point at the end of the game, although not that much, so you kind of inclined to spend gold as much as possible to avoid having that city festival. And also these extra actions on the demand cards. Do you spend them immediately? On the first glance it doesn't matter whether you spend it now or you spend it later, you get an extra action over the course of the game. If you save them towards the end of the game and maybe even play them in the last round, as the red player did, then of course you know exactly what to do with those actions to get the best result. As opposed to you spend your 3 actions over the game at some point, then you might do something which benefits you now and maybe even gets you a leg up on your opponents, but was it the best action at that point? I'm also, again, not sure yet of these buildings that basically duplicate the buildings you start with, but they use workers. They seem very interesting because at the beginning of the game, workers are more available than artisans. Maybe in this game it wasn't the best idea for Red to do this because he had actually not as many workers as the other players and he had to perform extra actions to get those other workers. Again, it seems very good to only have workers to use instead of artisans. On the other hand, it costs you quite some actions to actually get all that infrastructure set up. And also the other players can greatly benefit from that, because now they can trade for all those goods for only 1 trade token instead of 2. And finally, the mission cards. They are a very good addition to this game. I think the game would still be good and interesting if they weren't there, but like this, every game is different because you have to take different things into account. The rules also suggest different card combinations depending on what kind of game you would like. So for a more peaceful game, focused on expanding, use all those cards that reward you for having certain industries. If you want a more competitive game, use the cards that reward you for majorities in the different population cubes, expedition cards and so on. And also to make the game more complex, the rules suggest to include the cards that give you extra actions and abilities. So to sum this up, I like this game very much. I guess I just need to play it a bit more often, and that's it. So as always, thanks for watching, have fun playing, and until next time, bye bye.